Welcome to Getting Our Reward Heads Together, the podcast for reward and HR leaders brought to you by Reward Heads. Each episode we explore the ideas, challenges and innovations shaping how organisations design, deliver and talk about reward. We're a boutique consultancy creating bespoke solutions for our clients, but we'll tell you more about that after the episode. For now, let's get started. Hello and welcome back to Getting Our Reward Heads Together, where we explore the big issues in pay, performance and people strategy and what they mean in practice for HR and reward. My name is Victoria Milford and I'm the CEO of Reward Heads. Claire Williams, our consulting director, and I are talking about the gender pay gap today, why waiting is not a strategy and what meaningful action actually looks like for employers.
Hi, Victoria. Yes. We've done lots of gender pay gap analysis and reports over the years. So I'm looking forward very much to talking about what we've learned and what others can potentially also learn from that.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's the 10th anniversary this year, and we've seen recent analysis suggesting that the gender pay gap won't close for another 30 years if progress continues at the current rate, 2056. So what was your reaction when you saw that?
Honestly, not shocked, frustrated though, because the data isn't new, the pace isn't new. What worries me is the quiet acceptance that can creep in. 30 years effectively says this is structural, it'll take time. And yes, it is structural, but that can become a real excuse for inaction.
Yeah. And as I say, we've been reporting it for 10 years now, and the dial's hardly moved at all, has it? The headline number's about 12.8%, something like that overall, with much wider gaps in certain industries. But I think many organisations say, well, we don't pay men and women differently for the same role. So why is this an issue? So where do you think the disconnect is?
Well, that's exactly the point, and where confusion comes in for some. The gender pay gap isn't about equal pay for equal work. It's about the distribution. So who sits in higher paying roles, who earns higher bonuses, who progresses faster, whose salaries have compounded over 10 or 15 years. You can be compliant on equal pay and still have a significant gender pay gap. And that's where the discomfort begins.
Yeah. So do you think that organisations kind of stall when they see they have a large gap? And why do you think that would be?
Well, my take would be because the task feels so enormous. I mean, huge. It's not one lever, it's multiple things. Occupational segregation, leadership pipelines, career pauses, bonus design and legacy pay decisions embedded in base salary. And, let's be realistic, when something feels complex and, potentially quite expensive, the temptation is to monitor that rather than actually act. I've seen a lot of, well, we're broadly in line with our sector, but being average doesn't make something acceptable.
No, absolutely. And you're right, it is much more complex than one simple number or one process. And we cover that in our online module, where we sort of encourage people to think about it in lots of different ways and look at lots of different processes. So what do you think are the real risks of just kind of sitting tight and hoping it's just going to drop a little bit every year?
Well, they're bigger than people think. First of all, there's credibility. So you can talk a good talk about inclusion, equity, culture, but if your published data tells a different story, employees see that. And then second, there's engagement. So when commentary lands like women effectively work 47 days, for free compared to men, that's really emotional. Even if the gap is structurally driven, perception shapes trust. And, when trust is broken, that's tricky. And then that kind of leads on to the retention risk. So the widest gaps often sit in the sort of 50 to 59 age bracket. So that's experienced talent. So if mid-career women see slower progression and persistent disparity, well, they're going to disengage, or they just leave. And replacing that experienced talent is far more expensive and difficult than proactively addressing the root causes.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've said, it's been 10 years in the UK since we've had to report the numbers, and we're seeing that in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, for example, there's a requirement to report on gender pay. But what else is coming in terms of regulatory requirements that organisations need to be aware of?
Yeah, and this is where, sitting still becomes risky. So employers are moving beyond simply reporting the numbers. There's an increasing expectation and in some cases requirement to publish a formal action plan alongside gender pay gap data. That means publicly setting out what's driving the gap, what actions they're going to take, and over what time frame, and who is actually accountable for that. That changes the conversation. It moves from just disclosure to how are we actually going to deliver that. And we're also seeing increasing focus on menopause as a workplace issue. And this is quite timely, us doing this podcast, because the government have just launched landmark gender pay gap and menopause action plans to help women thrive at work ahead of International Women's Day. So for 2026, organisations are being encouraged to have specific menopause action plans and publish what steps they're taking to support employees through menopause. But then from spring 2027, that will become mandatory. And we have to think about, why does that matter for pay? Well, because menopause can materially affect retention, progression and participation at senior levels. If women step back or exit at that stage, it widens the pay gap further. So what perhaps has been seen previously as a nice to have well-being initiative, that's not the case anymore. It links directly to workforce sustainability and gender representation at leadership level.
So hopefully some proactive steps coming there then. So I've mentioned the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So we know things are happening in Europe around pay transparency. So what is it that's happening there, and could that influence what's happening in the UK?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's important. Under the EU Pay Transparency Directive, organisations will face even more rigorous obligations. If a gender pay gap of more than 5% can't be objectively justified, employers may be required to take corrective action, including conducting joint pay assessments with employee representatives. That's a really significant shift. It introduces consequence, not just disclosure, going back to what we were saying before. And while the UK is no longer bound by EU directives, regulatory influence doesn't stop at borders. We've historically seen alignment or similar reforms follow on. So even if the UK framework remains different, the direction of travel is clear: more transparency, more accountability, and potentially more structured intervention where gaps exceed certain thresholds. So forward-thinking organisations and some of our clients that we're talking to are watching that closely.
Yeah, and we have heard a lot from businesses saying that cost pressures are already very high. The national insurance change last year was a real big one, and continuing increases national minimum wage, for example. I think there's concern that further intervention is going to add further financial strain. Do you think that's the case? Do you agree with it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Totally get the cost argument completely. But unmanaged gaps also have a cost. It's a slightly hidden cost. So higher turnover, weaker leadership diversity, reduced discretionary effort, which is often really hidden, and reputational risk. So the difference is that those costs sit in different budget lines: recruitment, engagement, brand, whatever. So they're less visible. So doing nothing isn't cost neutral, it's just cost delayed or put somewhere else.
Mm. So what do you think meaningful action really looks like? Because like close the gap sounds huge.
Well, it is huge if you treat it as a headline target. But it's a bit like that old thing, isn't it? How do you eat an elephant? One chunk at a time. It becomes manageable when you break it down. So first of all, thinking about where exactly is the gap driven from in, your particular organisation, which functions, which levels or grades, how does bonus eligibility differ by gender? What does progression velocity look like? Are starting salaries consistent? And how are flexible working patterns influencing career trajectory? So there needs to be a structured pay gap action plan, not just a PR statement or a one-off adjustment. Just doesn't work. So, a deliberate multi-year strategy, it's not going to happen overnight.
But I think there's also, sorry.
No.
So I think there's also the argument that others aren't rushing, isn't there? That, competitors aren't making dramatic changes either. If you remember, before reporting was compulsory, there was the opportunity to do it voluntarily, and hardly any organisation did.
Yeah.
Do you think that influences behaviour?
Yeah, absolutely. If your competitors aren't making significant changes, it can feel commercially safer, to wait and see. But leadership isn't about hiding in the average. Regulation is tightening, as we've already said. Reporting is expanding. Action plans are becoming mandatory. So businesses can either move intentionally now or react later under pressure. I'd say, one feels strategic and the other feels a bit sort of defensive and reactive.
So what do you think is the mindset shift that organisations should be making? What would you really like to see them do?
So I think to stop thinking in terms of instant closure and start thinking in terms of that trajectory. Are they working towards narrowing the gap? Are they addressing the root causes? And do they have a plan? And are they being transparent about that plan? Because if the progress remains passive, well, as you said before, the maths says 2056. Blimey, that's a long time off, and that should make us feel really uncomfortable.
All right, if someone's listening to this and thinking, oh my goodness, that's us, the gap is there and it feels really daunting, what would you say?
I'd say that's not failure, that's reality. That a lot of businesses and organisations are in that situation. The issue isn't having a gap. The issue is pretending it will fix itself. It won't. So with structured analysis and clear commercial guardrails and leadership intent, you can make measurable progress without destabilising the business. And that's where I think thoughtful reward strategy really matters.
Absolutely. So Claire, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this.
Pleasure.
At Reward Heads, we work with organisations, don't we, to turn gender pay gap reporting into those targeted, commercially grounded actions, whether that's diagnostics and action planning or leadership conversations and communication. So if you'd like some support with your gender pay gap strategy, please do get in touch with us, either on rewardsolutions at reward.co.uk or check out the website www.rewardheads.co.uk. And that online module that I referenced on gender pay is part of a suite of 18 modules covering lots of different subjects in reward. So do take a look. And thank you for listening to Getting Our Reward Heads Together. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, where we'll be exploring more of the big themes in reward and benefits and what they mean for you in practice.
Thanks for listening to Getting Our Reward Heads Together, brought to you by Reward Heads. We're a boutique reward consultancy working with organisations across the UK and beyond. Our mission is to help HR and reward leaders design fair, engaging and effective reward frameworks and solutions. from pay and benefits to recognition and governance. Every solution we create is bespoke, built around each client's unique goals and challenges. We also offer coaching, resourcing, and trusted forums to keep you connected to the latest reward trends. If we can support your reward journey, we'd love to hear from you.